Welcome back to another one of your flipped lectures. Today we're going to review more causes of the Civil War from 1848 to 1860. And a lot of these conflicts that are going to lead to the Civil War are going to kind of be traced back to what happens after the Mexican-American War. As we know, after the Mexican-American War, the United States won a large piece of territory from Mexico and conquered it as a consequence of the war. Of course, now the United States has all this new land. And as we have seen before, kind of the big conflict, the big question is of course going to be, is all this new Western territory going to be slave or is it going to be free? Is it going to ally itself with the South or the North? And so there was a big debate over this, although to the South they didn't think that there was any sort of a debate. They believed the issue of kind of the spread of slavery into new territories had already been decided by the Missouri Compromise. And so in their minds, all of kind of that southern territory that was gained from Mexico as a part of this war was going to be slave. And any new states that came out of that territory were going to be slave states. So the South is very excited about this. But the northern states, especially those who did not want to see slavery spread into new territories, decided to try to do something to prevent the spread of slavery. And so a politician by the name of David Wilmot from Pennsylvania, a northern state, added a proviso, which is a condition. That's what a proviso is. And it added to a war bill, a war money bill. And so the Congress has to vote to basically give the United States money to pay back its debts from the war. David Wilmot put a condition in there that any money that the Congress would give the government to pay for its debts would have to basically say that there will not be slavery in any territory taken from Mexico. So basically what he's saying is he's threatening not to pay for the war if slavery spreads into this new Mexican territory. Now this bill does not pass because the South and a lot of Northerners believe that simply you cannot put that kind of a condition on something, and also on something as important as a war bill, and they also said that the Missouri Compromise had solved the problem. But to the South, even though this does not happen, the Wilmot Proviso to them is something significant. They are outraged by it for a couple of reasons. The first is that this is another example of mistrust between North and South. The South is going to view the Northerners as sneaky and aggressive towards the South, the Southern way of life. They're going to think that the North is trying to kind of end slavery kind of very sneakily, using kind of like not actually having the vote on slavery, but trying to outlaw it without the South's consent. They also believe that the states, not the national government, the states own that new territory in common. And so in their mind, the national government, because they said the national government doesn't own the new territory, they say they do not even have the right to ban slavery in that new territory. This creates kind of a lot of tensions. John C. Calhoun said that political revolution, anarchy, and even civil war would begin if the North did not listen to Southern concerns. And so this Wilmot Proviso, in a lot of ways, tells us something about the conflicts between North and South. It tells us that this is about slavery. It's about balance of power. But it's also a conflict about kind of states and federal government. Who owns these new states? Who owns this new territory? And does the national federal government have the right to ban slavery? And so the Wilmot Proviso is another really kind of great example of how tensions and mistrust between North and South continue to develop as new territories are brought into the country. After the fiasco that was the Wilmot Proviso, a couple of politicians come up with an idea that gains a lot of popularity. This idea is called popular sovereignty. And what it was an attempt to solve the problem of slavery in new territories. Rather than, these people said, rather than have the North and the South battle each other over whether or not to allow new territory to be slave or free, the idea of popular sovereignty says that the citizens of the territory can decide for themselves, they can vote for themselves if they want to be a free or a slave state. And this hope And the hope of this is to really take the issue of slavery out of the national debate, to allow that issue of slavery to be dealt with by the people in these new territories and not be dealt with as kind of the North as a whole and the South as a whole. But whenever there is voting, that can cause problems. Because whenever there is a vote on something that people think is important, there are always going to be some people who are going to try to rig that vote or maybe even prevent that vote from happening. And the Mexican-American War also brings us to the last compromise. The last time that the North and the South are really going to work out one of these agreements to avoid civil war. The issue of the Compromise of 1850 is California. In 1849, there was a massive gold rush, which is why the San Francisco football team today is named the 49ers. These new people, these 49ers coming into California, very quickly grew the state into something unmanageable. There was chaos. There was too many people. There was violence, lawlessness. And so California needs to be a state. They need a government to help them keep order. They need kind of assistance from the federal government. But the only problem with this is that California is going to upset the balance between slave states and free in the country. And so this is the great debate. California wants to be a free state, and so the North supports that. But again, there's going to be more free states than slave states if California comes into the Union. And so the South, fearful that the imbalance is going to lead to basically the North with their bigger population, more political influence, to start limiting both slavery and states' rights. Remember, the South is very fearful that their traditional order of things, their way of life, is being threatened by the North. And they fear the North, with their bigger population and more political power, it was only a matter of time, they thought, before the North would basically compel the South to basically change and do things that they did not want to do. So at this point, the South again considers secession. They again consider leaving the Union, going out on their own, and remember, they believe that they have every right to do this. But to try to prevent secession, to try to prevent potential civil war, the great compromiser Henry Clay stepped in again and proposed a compromise to try to solve this crisis. Henry Clay's proposed compromise had a couple of parts. It said that California would become a free state. It also said that popular sovereignty would be used to settle slavery in the new territories of Utah and New Mexico, basically taking those states out of the debate. The slave trade would also be banned in the nation's capital, though slavery would still be legal, but just not the buying and selling of slaves. And then finally, for the South, Henry Clay promised the passage of a Fugitive Slave Act, which would basically allow for the South to have a lot more leeway in keeping and capturing escaped slaves, and also assurances that the slave trade in the United States would in fact remain legal. And so this is the map of the compromise. We can kind of look at kind of the free states and free territories versus slave states. And then a large piece of that territory won in the Mexican-American War would be determined by popular sovereignty, which means that the citizens in those territories would vote on the slave issue. So here's a nice little graphic at who gets what. The North gets some of what they want. They get California as a free state, and they get the slave trade banned in the capital. Both sides agree on the idea of popular sovereignty in Utah and New Mexico. That basically those states can go either way, and so it takes those territories out of this debate. And for the South, they get a new Fugitive Slave Act. They get assurances to make the slave trade stay legal to basically protect the institutions of slavery that the South was so afraid of losing. But this compromise was only proposed. The Senate of the United States still had to vote to approve this compromise. And so a great debate was held where both opponents and proponents of the compromise of 1850 spoke to the Senate and to the entire country about their views. John C. Calhoun, who at this point is basically on his deathbed, traveled to D.C. and gave his speech to another senator to read because he was too weak and too old to basically read it. In his speech, John C. Calhoun said that no compromise would save the Union, that the only thing the South had left to do was to secede and keep their honor. Senator Daniel Webster of Massachusetts rose and basically gave a speech defending the Union and defending the compromise. His speech is one of the most famous in Senate history, as he tried to convince both the people in the Senate as well as the entire country the merits of compromise and how important it was to try to keep the country together. So as I said, reactions to this compromise. John C. Calhoun said it wasn't going to save the Union, and that is what the reading This Cry of Union is all about. Daniel Webster urged compromise to avoid civil war and save the Union. He said there can be no such thing as peaceful secession. Peaceful secession is an utter impossibility. I see plainly, as I see the sun in heaven, what that disruption itself must produce. I see that it must produce war, and such a war as I will not describe. And the compromise split the country to the point where there was not enough support on either side to either pass it or to really get rid of it. And so the compromise kind of dies until a new Senate came in. John C. Calhoun, the defender of the South, would die, leaving a new generation of Southern senators to lead the South through the next stage of history. Henry Clay, the great compromiser, retired from the Senate, and so there would be no more great compromises. Daniel Webster also, after his defense of the compromise, is going to see his political career pretty much end. And so, these kind of lions of government, these people who had held the country together with their compromises, are now all gone. And a new Senate, including Illinois' Stephen A. Douglas, also known as the Great Debater, would eventually pass all the parts of the compromise separately and quietly once all the tensions had lowered. But the Compromise of 1850 shows us a number of things. It shows us a lot of these issues of the war. So see if you can figure out which of these causes the Compromise of 1850 shows us. So the Compromise of 1850 is going to ease tensions over slavery for a little while. The South feels assured that slavery will not end. The North feels comfortable with California as a free state. But very quickly, tensions are going to rise over the next 10 years. And a lot of these tensions grew out of the Fugitive Slave Act. And the Fugitive Slave Act was a law that was passed to basically help Southerners reclaim slaves that had run away, that they were considered to be fugitive. And what the Fugitive Slave Act allowed, it was a law that allowed escaped slaves to be taken from free states in the North and returned back to slavery in the South to their owners. There was not a high standard of evidence that was needed to prove that somebody was a former slave. So actually, a lot of free blacks and those who had even never been slaves could be kidnapped and sold into slavery in the South. This law also forced Northerners and Northern policemen and federal marshals to help slave hunters catch escaped slaves. The Northerners, who were very, very comfortable, basically living life aware that slavery was in the South, but it wasn't in the North, now all of a sudden had slavery thrust into their everyday lives. Northerners started resisting the Fugitive Slave Act, started refusing to help Southerners return slaves, and they would sometimes resist the Fugitive Slave Act violently, assaulting slave catchers, forming mobs in order to protect freed slaves. And so this caused tensions. The South was outraged at the North's refusal to obey the law. They felt there was a double standard, that the North kept expecting them to follow the laws of the federal government, but that the North wasn't even going to follow the federal government. They believed that their way of life was under attack, and they believed that there was a double standard, that the North felt that it could do whatever it wanted, obey which laws that it did, and yet they wanted to compel the South to obey all the laws. And so this started to create a lot of tensions between North and South. So the Fugitive Slave Act, see if you can figure out what were the causes that the Fugitive Slave Act shows us. So now I want to talk about an interesting cultural cause, a book written by a woman called Harriet Beecher Stowe. There are some books that end up being viral hits. Things like Harry Potter, things like The Hunger Games, where it seems like almost everybody has read these books and almost everyone is able to talk about them. Well, Harriet Beecher Stowe wrote a book in 1852 called Uncle Tom's Cabin. It was a novel that depicted the horrors of slavery. It's a very melodramatic book. Parts of it are actually not even accurate. But she makes a very strong emotional argument, getting you to be invested in these characters, these slaves, and then kind of pulling on your heartstrings as they go through kind of this horrible tragedy. It becomes one of the most popular books of the era. She sells millions of copies in a time where there weren't even that many Americans, only 32 million Americans. And what Uncle Tom's Cabin does is kind of like Common Sense, kind of like some other things we've talked about. It starts to change public opinion and starts to get Northerners around to the idea that, one, slavery was evil, and two, that Northerners should resist slavery and even actively work to end it. The impact of this on public opinion in the North was so big that it is considered by almost every historian to be its own cause of the war. When Abraham Lincoln met Harriet Beecher Stowe, he said, "Oh, so you're the woman who wrote that little book and started this big war." Uncle Tom's Cabin, to the Northerners, it shows them what slavery is like in a way that they can understand it, a novel, they read it, and then this changes their opinion and leads them to resist the South and start to distrust the South even more. So tensions in the country are high over the slave issue, over the states' rights issue, over new territories. And some of those territories are going to actually break out into all-out warfare. From 1855 to 1856, the issues of slavery, the issues of North versus South, are going to all combine to make the new territory, the new potential state of Kansas, quite literally bleed. And this conflict is known as the Border War because a lot of this conflict happened between the border of Kansas and the state of Missouri. Even today, the Kansas-Missouri football and basketball games are referred to openly as the Border War. And so there's going to be war in Kansas. So it's interesting to look at, why was there war in Kansas? And the actual reason is because of our city of Chicago and one of our most famous senators in Illinois, Stephen A. Douglas. Stephen A. Douglas was one of kind of these new leaders in the Senate, and he knew that the future was going to be in the Transcontinental Railroad. He wanted very, very badly to have that railroad go through the city of Chicago, to make Chicago basically the center of all commerce, where all the railroads would converge. He believed this would make Chicago a great city, and he believed that it would make Illinois into a great state. And so Stephen A. Douglas, in order to get that railroad to come through Chicago, basically had to create a state, the state of Kansas, which is right next to Missouri. If the railroad went through the Midwest and not the South, then that Transcontinental Railroad would make Chicago and Illinois very, very wealthy and very, very important. And so Stephen A. Douglas basically looks at the Northwestern Territories. The Northwest Territories are Kansas and Nebraska. They are the states directly to the west of Missouri and Iowa. There was a lot more people in there. People who were settling, homesteaders, and also they were looking at creating the first transcontinental railroad from the East Coast all the way to the West Coast. And so Stephen A. Douglas writes a law in order to make these states of Kansas and Nebraska real. Basically, the idea is they are going to divide this territory into two states, but what is going to be different about this is that they are not going to deal with the compromise. This law repeals the Missouri Compromise. It takes that line that was written on the map that divided slave state from free, and it allowed the possibility of slavery in new northern territories. Stephen A. Douglas believed very firmly in popular sovereignty. He believed that Americans could simply vote to decide if they should be free or slave. But that vote was going to cause a ton of controversy. And again, that compromise line no longer going to apply after the Kansas-Nebraska Act. And the Kansas-Nebraska Act is viewed very differently by the North and the South. To the North, this is an atrocious plot by the South to spread slavery. They believed it broke the promise of the Missouri Compromise to limit the spread of slavery into new northern territories. The South, of course, is going to support this and support popular sovereignty because it allows for the possibility of new slave states if the people in Kansas and Nebraska vote to allow slavery. And so here's what happens. Once it's announced that there's going to be a vote, both the pro- and anti-slavery extremists are all going to go from where they are into Kansas to try to influence the vote. They're not only going to bring their political opinions, they're going to bring their weapons. Pro-slavery border ruffians from the slave state of Missouri stormed into Kansas. They brought cannons with them, they brought rifles, and they went to basically start a war to make Kansas a slave state. The anti-slavery groups and anti-slavery settlers in Kansas also armed themselves. And so what you actually have in the state of Kansas is a mini civil war breaks out. The vote is held, and the pro-slavery side ends up winning. So Kansas, according to popular sovereignty, is going to become a slave state. But the pro-slavery legislature, the pro-slavery government that was created, was not acknowledged by all people. The anti-slavery people formed their own government. So now what you have are two competing governments in Kansas, both claiming to be the government of Kansas. The United States president this time did nothing about this. And so open warfare started between these two groups. 200 people would be killed in fighting between pro- and anti-slavery people in Kansas, trying to determine the future of the state. And $2 million worth of property will be damaged. Also in Kansas is a character called John Brown. And John Brown is going to be a very, very famous figure in this story, and I will come back to his role in Bleeding Kansas a little bit later. But the idea here is that now tensions have spilled over into violence, where you have these two sides, representing the North and the South, pro- and anti-slavery, are actually fighting each other with weapons in a mini-civil war in the state of Kansas. So the Kansas-Nebraska Act and Bleeding Kansas, see if you can figure out what do these show us about the causes of the war. Now I want to tell you about another instance of violence, but not one that happened in Kansas, not one that happened during the Civil War, but one that happened in the halls of government. The caning of Senator Charles Sumner. And when I say caning, I mean being beaten almost to death with a cane. Senator Charles Sumner of Massachusetts was one of the great kind of abolitionist senators. He was really anti-slavery. He gave a speech in the Senate openly condemning the South and openly insulting a Southern senator by the name of Andrew Butler. He called him a series of names, including a pimp and a pimp for slavery. And so Andrew Butler, a Southern senator, basically had to sit there and listen to someone insult him. Now, Andrew Butler was a senator. He was not going to retaliate with violence. But his cousin, Preston Brooks, was a member of the House of Representatives. And Preston Brooks believed that Sumner had offended Southern honor. He had insulted the honor of his family and his cousin, Andrew Butler. And so, on the floor of the United States Senate, Preston Brooks walked into the chamber, confronted Sumner, and beat him with his metal-topped cane, beating him again and again and again until Sumner was left a bloodied and crippled body on the Senate floor. This was a huge deal because the violence, passion, and hatred had finally reached a boiling point where violence was happening on the floor of the United States Senate. You had people now bringing guns, bringing knives into the Senate chamber to defend themselves. And you have now personal violence breaking out even in the halls of U.S. government. Northerners believed that this showed them all they needed to know about the South. That Southerners were savage peoples, they were brutal, they were violent, and that is all that the North needed to know about the Southerners and their slaveholding society. To the South, they saw basically this guy, Preston Brooks, as a hero. People sent him canes and like with notes that said, "Hit him again." And they thought that he was very brave for standing up for family honor and defending Southern honor against Northerners. And so this shows us both the attitude of Northerners towards the Southerners and also Southerners towards the Northerners, that they were tired of being looked down on by the North. And so they applauded when they believed that Preston Brooks had defended Southern honor. The next major cause of the Civil War is going to actually happen in 1857. It's going to be a Supreme Court case where Dred Scott, a slave, actually sued his master in court for his freedom. Dred Scott was a slave who had lived in states like Illinois and others, Minnesota, that were actually free states. And so he sued his master for his freedom, saying that he lived in a free state and so he should be allowed to be free. But the Supreme Court, which also is packed with Southerners, ruled a couple of things. Firstly, they ruled that slaves are not citizens of the United States, and so they cannot sue in the courts. So they basically threw out Dred Scott's case, saying that slaves are not people, they're not citizens, they don't have the right to sue. What the Dred Scott decision also said was that it said that the Constitution basically said that the federal government could not ban slavery in any new territories. Now that had nothing to do with the actual case of Dred Scott, but the Supreme Court basically is now ruling that the federal government could not ban slavery. And so the Dred Scott decision is a Southern-run Supreme Court supporting the Southern idea that the United States, the federal government, does not control new territories, the states do. And so the federal government did not have the authority to actually outlaw slavery in new territories. What this did is it repealed the Missouri Compromise. It said that compromise line that everyone had been ignoring was unconstitutional. This is a very controversial decision, and it was a Supreme Court made up mostly of Southerners. So that kind of tells us why they rule how they do. And so now we're almost to the Civil War. We're 2 years away. And in 1858, Abraham Lincoln, a member of the of the Illinois Assembly, gave a speech in Springfield, Illinois, to the Illinois state government. And the Abraham Lincoln said, "A house divided against itself cannot stand. I believe this government cannot endure permanently half slave and half free. I do not expect the Union to be dissolved. I do not expect the house to fall. But I do expect it will cease to be divided. It will become all one thing or all the other. Either the opponents of slavery will arrest the further spread of it and place it where the public mind shall rest in the belief that it is in the course of ultimate extinction, or its advocates will push it forward till it shall become alike lawful in all the states, old as well as new, north as well as south." Lincoln's House Divided speech kind of gives us a good insight into the idea that Americans by 1858, many of them do not think that these compromises are going to work, that these two societies can exist side by side, that the country at some point is going to have to become either all slave, all free, or it's going to basically fall apart. And after he gives this speech, Abraham Lincoln throws his hat in the ring to run for the Illinois Senate seat in 1858. His opponent was a legendary senator named Stephen A. Douglas, who, though short of stature, was known as the Great Debater for his fiery debate skills and his great speaking skills. In the Senate race, Douglas and Lincoln agreed to a series of 7 debates, and they were all over Illinois. The Lincoln-Douglas debates became kind of some of the most famous debates in all of American history. The accounts of what they said, their exact words, were recorded and reprinted in newspapers all around the country. Because the big issue in the Lincoln-Douglas debates was slavery, and especially slavery's spread into new territories. Stephen A. Douglas defended the idea of popular sovereignty, that all new territories should be able to vote on whether or not to be free or slave. Abraham Lincoln was what was known as a free soiler. Basically, the idea is that any new soil, any new territories by the United States should be free, and that slavery should remain where it was, but that slavery should not go any further. These debates had a huge impact on the national discourse. And again, it shows us that by 1858, one of the biggest political issues of the day is in fact slavery, new territories, and the future of the balance between the North and the South in the United States. And so there's a lot of tensions we've talked about. There's a lot of problems going on in the United States, and it doesn't seem like these sides have anything to agree on. Sometimes when you have all that tension, all those things bubbling beneath the surface, all you need is a spark. And this spark is going to come in the form of a man called John Brown. Now, John Brown was not a successful man at pretty much anything, failure at almost everything in his life. But John Brown, more than anyone else, is going to lead kind of to the actual start of the Civil War. Now, John Brown had made a name for himself in Kansas. During Bleeding Kansas, John Brown had taken his sons into the territory and had made a name for himself by murdering slaveholders and trying to incite slaves against their masters. One story involves John Brown going into the home of a pro-slavery family with his sons and hacking them to death with swords. And so John Brown is an anti-slavery terrorist. He is fighting, destroying property, and murdering people. But he doesn't think that's enough. So he makes a new plan. John Brown is going to end slavery once and for all. He has this kind of true believerism, that he believes he is chosen by God to end slavery. So his plan is to take the federal arsenal, which is a store of weapons. That's what an arsenal is, a big collection of weapons, at a place called Harper's Ferry, Virginia. It's a town. And what he would do with these weapons is he was going to arm the slaves and start a slave rebellion. And so he and his sons and a couple of followers attack this arsenal, and they take it, and he expects that all the slaves are going to rise up and join him. Only no one does. No slaves rise up and join John Brown. In fact, nobody comes to help him at all. The townspeople and the United States Marines, led by Colonel Robert E. Lee, did arrive, and they attacked John Brown and his followers at Harper's Ferry, and they capture him, and eventually John Brown is executed for treason, for trying to overthrow the government of Virginia via this slave rebellion. But John Brown's raid, though unsuccessful in pretty much every way, is going to be the spark that is going to cause the war. John Brown's raid is all the proof the South needs, that the Northerners are plotting slave uprisings, and that all of the conflicts over the last 40 years have been building up to their plan to destroy the Southern way of life, the Southern states, and slavery. Southern militias start forming and training intensely to begin to defend themselves against possible slave rebellions and against a possible Northern invasion. This is the start of the Confederate Army, are these Southern militias that form after John Brown. From this point forward, the South is no longer looking to compromise. They are starting to see the North as a threat, and this is going to basically kind of lead tensions to boil over, leading into a presidential election in 1860. So by the year 1860, the stage is basically set. Tensions have gained their highest level, and civil war is almost imminent. The last straw is going to be the presidential election of 1860. In 1860, 4 people run for the presidency. A new party, the Republican Party, decided to run Abraham Lincoln of Illinois, kind of using the fame of the Lincoln-Douglas debates to catapult him kind of into the presidency. The Democratic Party split in two, with Southern Democrats being represented by John Breckinridge and Northern Democrats being represented by Illinois' Stephen A. Douglas. There was also a third party, Constitutional Union Party, that basically was John Bell. And so these candidates were all running for the presidency in 1860. But again, when you have a lot of people running for president, what's going to happen is it's going to split the vote. Abraham Lincoln is going to win the election with 59% of the Electoral College, but only 40% of the popular vote. And in fact, Abraham Lincoln, who runs as a Republican, he actually is not even on the ballot in 10 of these southern states. But Abraham Lincoln is elected president because the two other candidates split the Democratic vote, and so Lincoln is elected. But Abraham Lincoln and the Republican Party were not the party of abolition. They did not want to end slavery. They were what are known as free soilers. They opposed slavery in new territories, and that they did not want to outlaw slavery where it was, but they did not want it to spread. But the Republicans also supported higher tariffs. And so to the South, even though they don't really support the abolition of slavery, the South believes it's only a matter of time before the Republicans will outlaw slavery. So after Abraham Lincoln is elected, the South believes that basically their time in the United States should be over. Lincoln wasn't even on the ballot in the southern states, and Lincoln to them is not their president. And so, almost immediately after Abraham Lincoln is elected president, South Carolina holds a vote where they elect to secede and leave the United States and create their own kind of independent country. Then the states of Mississippi, Florida, Alabama, Georgia, Louisiana, and Texas are going to follow soon after. So shortly after Abraham Lincoln was elected president, his country started to tear itself apart. All attempts at compromises have failed, and the South feared Abraham Lincoln, and they saw his election as the last straw, that the North would simply always use their larger population and political power to control the South. And so all of the seceding states decided to basically band together and declare their own country. They declared independence from the United States, and they created their own constitution. They called this new country the Confederate States of America, being very clear in the title that these states were only in a confederacy. They were in an alliance, they were not one country. And the constitution they created had changes that gave the states total rights, total power over any central government, and it also protected slavery. They then elected Jefferson Davis, the first and only president of the Confederacy. Jefferson Davis had been a senator from Mississippi, and he reluctantly accepted the presidency of the Confederacy, knowing that the future of these countries was going to likely be met with great hardship, war, and destruction. And so, all over the country, newspapers carried the headline, "The Union is dissolved, new Confederacy." And so, with this, the United States, to a certain extent, has now split in two, where what used to be one country is now two, with the United States of America comprising of the northern states and California and Oregon, and the Confederate States consisting of the southern states, the slaveholding states. Missouri, Kentucky, part of Virginia, and then basically Maryland did not join either side. They stayed loyal to the United States of America, but they were border states. They were slaveholding states, and so to them, kind of any sort of attempt by the United States government to ban slavery would likely push them into the Confederacy. So the Confederate States of America were born. They created a new flag, had a new anthem, and declared themselves free and independent of the United States. So in 1861, Abraham Lincoln prepared to take the oath of office to become the President of the United States. He was becoming president during a time of division and during a time of imminent war. And in his inauguration, Lincoln said, "In your hands, my dissatisfied countrymen, and not in mine, is the momentous issue of civil war. The government will not assail you. You can have no conflict without you yourselves being the aggressors. We are not enemies, but friends. We must not be enemies. Though passion may have strained, it must not break our bonds of affection." And Lincoln, in his inauguration, extended an olive branch to the South hoping to bring them back to the negotiating table to talk about the future of the nation. But on April 12th of 1861, shortly after Lincoln took office, the Confederate States of America and the Confederate Army opened fire on a United States government fort in South Carolina at Fort Sumter, and the first shots have been fired in the war between the southern states, the Confederacy, and the North, the Union.